What is going on, everybody? And this is going to be an interesting video. This is going to be a response video to Ian from the CU podcast on Pat the NES Punk's channel about his thoughts on the SNES, aka the Super Nintendo, and why he doesn't like it. Now, I've been a subscriber of Pat the NES Punk for quite a few years now. He makes pretty good content. I first discovered him from watching The Angry Video Game Nerd. And he does this podcast with his friend, Ian. And honestly, I've watched a couple of them, and I never really found them that particularly interesting most of the time. So I don't really follow them. But this video title right here got me interested. Because I have never really heard anyone actually flat out say that they do not like the Super Nintendo. Even people who did not own a Super Nintendo growing up, at least say they at least respect the system, or they just really don't have an opinion on it at all because they never owned one. I've really never heard anyone flat out say, I don't like the Super Nintendo, and here's why. So, I was really interested to hear his reasoning as to why he does not like the Super Nintendo, and his reasoning, to be perfectly honest, is just insane. It just really is. So let's get into this, and by the way, I will have the video linked in the description as always, just to show you that I'm not taking them out of context, and I have everything written down here as well, so let's get into it. Part of his problem with the SNES was that he didn't grow up with one, so he has no nostalgia towards it. See, I never really understood this reasoning. I never understood this reasoning that you have to have nostalgia towards a system to like it. Like, it can't be the library of the games, what the actual system produces graphically. It can't be any of that. No, it's got to be nostalgic. I never understood that logic. There's plenty of systems that I don't have any nostalgia towards, but I still respect them. Like, for example, the Sega Genesis. I have no nostalgia towards the Sega Genesis because I didn't grow up with one. But I don't dislike the Sega Genesis, and I respect the Sega Genesis, and I respect what Sega at the time did for the gaming industry overall. So even though I have no nostalgia towards it, that doesn't mean I dislike it. So I never really understood that logic. And it's kind of implying that one of the main reasons people like the Super Nintendo is because they're nostalgic towards it. No, people actually have reasons why they like the Super Nintendo. And then he goes on to say that he loved games like Super Mario World, Street Fighter II, F-Zero, Earthbound, ActRaiser, Super Mario Kart, and Super Castlevania 4. Okay, he just listed a bunch of games that he really loved. And they were all on the Super Nintendo. So, that's kind of strange to me. You love all of these games. It isn't just a few games, it's actually a bunch of games. But you don't like the system. Now, he never really goes into why he doesn't like the system specifically. Like, for example, I don't like the Xbox One as a system. There are some games on the Xbox One that I really enjoy, but I don't like the system itself. And I can give you reasons why I don't like the system itself. I don't like the UI interface that it has. I don't like the fact that a lot of the features are kind of glitchy. I don't like that the games take forever to install to the hard drive. There's things about the system I don't like, even though there's some games on it I do like. So you can dislike a system specifically and still like the games on it. But he never really explains at all why he just doesn't like the system. So I found that kind of odd. And then he goes on to say that it's a good system that has a lot of great RPGs, and that's one thing the Super Nintendo destroys the Sega Genesis on, and that is the RPG department. There are so many classic RPGs that are only on the Super Nintendo. and there are very few RPGs that were on the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis really excelled in beat-em-ups and sports games. But that's another funny thing, is that he says it's a good system. So if you think it's a good system, how do you dislike it? It doesn't make any sense. And honestly, when you actually watch the video and you look at him, like actually look at him in the video, his legs are shaking. He sounds kind of nervous, like he wants to say these things, but he doesn't truly back them up. Or he doesn't, I should say, he doesn't truly believe in them. So, I mean, it's just weird to me. How can you dislike a system and then turn around and say it's a good system? I don't understand that. And then he goes on to say that he doesn't like the Super Nintendo now because his main interest is platformers and shooters. Now, this is where this really gets weird. Now, the SNES has actually a lot of pretty good shooters. It's got the Mega Man games, it's got Star Fox, it's got Contra. It's got a lot of great shooters. Albeit, it doesn't have a insane abundance of shooters, especially in the United States, but it's got some great shooters. But then he says platformers. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, that's kind of strange, because that's literally one of the main things the Super Nintendo excels in, and that is platformers. It's got a ton of platformers. Hell, I found a site while actually doing research for this video that lists 250 plus platformers for the Super Nintendo. So, if you love platformers, the Super Nintendo sounds like a great system for you because it has a ton of different platformers. But then he says the SNES doesn't have a ton of platformers that he really enjoys, and then he goes on to say the thing that honestly got me really to make this video is that he says he doesn't like the Donkey Kong Country games. I'm sorry, I've never heard of anyone who says that they like platformers say that they do not like the Donkey Kong Country games. The Donkey Kong Country games are a blueprint for almost the perfect way to make a side-scrolling platformer. Of course, he doesn't go on to say why he doesn't like the Donkey Kong Country games. He says he's a big fan of platformers, but he doesn't explain why he doesn't like the Donkey Kong Country games. And to be perfectly honest, I think that he can't really explain why. And we will get into that later. We will definitely get into that. Although, some of you will probably know where this is probably headed. I'm kind of shocked. I've never heard of anyone say they like platformers but don't like the Donkey Kong Country games. I've never heard that personally. And then he says it doesn't have a great library of shooters. And I've already gone into that a little bit. It's got a pretty good abundance of shooters. I mean, I don't know, what is a shooter to him? What is his preference of shooter? The Super Nintendo has a pretty good variety of shooters. It's got first-person shooters, it's got some flying shooters, it's got some side-scrolling shooters, and then it's got the platforming shooters. I don't understand. All this is weird. All of this is weird to me. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And then he says, of course, that the SNES is strong with RPGs, which is true, but he doesn't have a lot of time to play RPGs. Okay, how does that make the Super Nintendo a bad system? Just because you don't have a lot of time to play RPGs? That makes you dislike the system? How does that logically make sense? I mean, you can't just respect the fact that it has a lot of great games, even if you don't have time to play them. I don't have a lot of time to really get into RPGs nowadays. I still play them as much as I can, but I don't have a lot of time to really sink my teeth into a lot of RPGs nowadays. But that doesn't mean I'm going to dislike them or dislike the system that they're on. I just don't understand how that logically makes the Super Nintendo a bad system. Because you don't have time to play RPGs. And then he says he doesn't love the SNES because he doesn't have the time to make use of its best assets. Once again, how does that make you not love the system just because you don't have the time? That's not the system's fault. And it's not really your fault either. It's just the reality of the situation. And if you don't have the time for it, that's fine. But don't say things like, I don't like the system because of that. Because it's not the system's fault. It's not. And then we get in to where this video is headed. And a lot of this really becomes clear at this point. Pat brings up the Sega Genesis. And Ian immediately goes into fanboy mode. So that right there tells you, okay, this guy is probably a Sega Genesis fanboy, and that is why he doesn't like the Super Nintendo. Because as soon as Pat brings up the Sega Genesis, Ian immediately enters fanboy mode. He then starts talking really fast, saying things like, oh, well, the Genesis experimented a lot more. It's got a lot more platformers that I like. It's got a lot more shooters that I like. The platformers on Genesis are more action-packed, and it's got great beat-em-ups. He talks like that, and when people usually talk like that, that means they're really entering fanboy mode where they just feel like that they have to jump up and defend that system. That is why his voice and demeanor changed at this point. But we will get into the specific points here. Okay, the Genesis experimented a lot more. In what way? In what way did the Sega Genesis experiment a lot more? The Sega Genesis, Sega just invented a 16-bit system. That is really all they did. And yes, it came out before the Super Nintendo. But it's not like that Nintendo was never going to make a 16-bit console. They were going to. If you think Nintendo only made the Super Nintendo just to counter the Sega Genesis, then you're out of your mind. They were always going to make one. They were just wanted to ride the wave of the NES as long as they can. And Sega wanted to get their console out first because a lot of times it feels like if you get your product out first, you'll get a head start. That's the same exact thing Microsoft did when they released the Xbox 360 a year ahead of the PlayStation 3 and the Wii. Because they wanted to get ahead of that console generation. But what did they really experiment on specifically? I don't understand. Did experimented with 16-bit graphics? I'm pretty sure Nintendo was already working with 16-bit graphics at that point. It's where the industry was headed. And there really isn't anything inside, specifically for the Sega Genesis, that made it seem like they were experimenting with new technology. And no, Sega fanboys, blast processing isn't real. Blast processing was a marketing tool by Sega just to show that their processor was faster than the Super Nintendo. Because it was. The Sega Genesis processor was faster than Nintendo, or the Super Nintendo. Although, honestly, in my experience, when you put games like Super Metroid and Donkey Kong Country, when he's in the barrel and shoots across the screen, when you put those side by side with games like Sonic, I don't really see Sonic being faster, or other Genesis games being faster. Honestly, I don't really see the processor difference there. I never really have, personally. So, I don't understand what you mean by they experimented more. I don't. Now, Sega did some cool things at the time, like they had cool game cases, where it's the game cases that we know now today with the holders, where Nintendo had those stupid paper boxes. So yeah, they did do some things that were different, but I just don't understand how they... I don't really know what they experimented on. I don't. Now, if you go with Nintendo, we can honestly say that Nintendo experimented with some new technology when they created the Super FX chip that they put into the Super Nintendo that created some three-dimensional images in a two-dimensional game. The biggest example being Star Fox. It was a two-dimensional game, but it had three-dimensional images. That right there is experimenting with technology. So, yeah, I can't agree with that. I can't agree with the fact that the Genesis experimented a lot more. I mean, unless you want to count the Sega CD and Sega 32X add-ons they put onto it, which eventually killed Sega. Unless you want to count those. I personally wouldn't. Okay, and he says he has a lot more platformers that he likes. Well, what kind of platformer do you like? You're just saying platformers. I don't understand that. I would love to know more. Because to me, this sounds like just someone who's a Sega fanboy who just desperately wants to defend the Genesis and then bash on the Super Nintendo. That's what this sounds like to me. You never go into details on what shooters and platformers you prefer that the Super Nintendo really doesn't have. And honestly, I don't think you do that because you know deep down that Super Nintendo does have those games. I mean, honestly, to be perfectly fair, he does go on to say the platformers on Genesis are more action-packed. I really don't know what means specifically by that. Is Sonic more action-packed than Donkey Kong Country? I mean, the premise of the game is the same. There's enemies, you jump on them, you get to the end of the stage. And there's power-ups, and there's different backdrops, and there's bosses. Like, I know Sonic is faster, but what do you mean by more action-packed? I mean, if you just mean faster, then okay, I guess. But see, to me, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. And even if you want to go that route, I'd argue that Super Metroid is just as fast. And then he says that Genesis has had a lot of great beat-em-ups, and they did. I will concede that. The Sega Genesis had a ton of great beat-em-ups, especially Streets of Rage. And it had more than the Super Nintendo. I will grant you that. And like I said earlier, it had a lot more sports games than the Super Nintendo. I'll grant you that as well. And then, once again, he says it's not a bad system. Well, if it's not a bad system, then why are you trying to downplay it and say that this is why you don't like it? The only thing I've really heard of is that you just don't like it because it's not as great as your precious Sega Genesis and you don't have time to play RPGs. That's really the only reasonings I heard in this video. And to me, those aren't great reasonings. They just aren't. It's one thing to have a personal preference of a console. That is perfectly fine. But that doesn't mean you have to dislike the other console, and that doesn't mean you have to attempt to disrespect the other console. You don't have to do it. You can just say, hey, I like this console, and I just like it better. That's really all you gotta say, but to me, this was just someone who is a Sega Genesis fanboy who just had to find a reason to downplay the Super Nintendo. To me, that's all this was, so, okay. I think I covered about everything. Please let me know your thoughts